product. So I don't know how dominant that is in what people are doing, but I've come across that quirk, and it would make me think that there's some advantage being capitalized upon, especially by cider houses that go, very much wild and natural. They don't use any cultured yeast, don't do any ciders with any additional flavoring. They take apples and pears off the trees, mash them up, press them, throw them in barrels, fermenters, whatever, and just kind of let them go, as you say, for however long it takes. It seems risky to me to do that. It seems to me like your microbial activity, the balance of that over that period of time can go beyond what a good solid fermentation can do for outcompeting other agents that might be in that cider. So to me, letting it ferment forever like that just doesn't seem like it makes a ton of sense, but I've not really experimented with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I did just see a question. Can you add too much fermade? Yes, you can. And so, Manny, you can't add too much fermade O. Oddly enough, I have actually had the experience where I have added too much fermade O.
Really?
And I actually got a cheesy flavor and aroma out of that mead. Actually, I had 3 meads, and it was during my initial fermade O trials. And I was using the recommendations of an earlier version of Tosna that has since been amended. And Sergio actually did come out and say that he had gotten some updated information from Scott Labs about it and made some corrections to it that in some cases, depending on gravity and whatnot, that the amounts had actually come down. So I think I probably used that and then further calculated it incorrectly. And I just... Well, I'll pull a bottle of those even now, and as soon as I pop the cork off of it, it's immediately what I smell. And it's like, that was the only difference. And it was 3 distinct types of mead, and that was the only difference between it and all the other meads that were made, say, in that same 3 or 4 month period, was those had fermate O, everything else had my prior nutrient protocol. But you can add too much of any nutrient. You can add way too much DAP. You can add way too much fermate K or superfood or yeast, generic yeast nutrient or yeast energizer. For anybody who's thinking, well, how do I know? More is not better in this case. Like, you can't just keep loading it up. It just doesn't make tons of sense just to keep loading it up with nutrients. If you're chasing after trying to get a ferment finish and you just continue to hitting it with nutrients, you've got something else that's going on.
I can tell you that I started when I first started using O. I started adding. It was a lot. I mean, I think it was like 18 grams in a batch of 5 gallons. And I kept going down lower and lower and lower, and I noticed that by the end I think at the end it was like 6 grams, but even 18 grams wasn't too much. So,
yeah, and that may not be. I mean, fermate O, you need to use more. Its organic nitrogen source is assimilable as the inorganic nitrogen that comes in the form of DAP and some of the other nutrients. So when you look at calculating, according to Tosna, or just a kind of a general, YAN plus what I need for nutrient, nitrogen needs for it, you're always going to use more fermate O in total. Therefore, your individual slots on each staggered day are going to be larger than you would for some other nutrient, typically because those have the inorganic nitrogen in them, which is concentrated. It's got more assimilable nitrogen per unit of measure. And so I don't know where I went wrong with it, but I certainly was not happy with my mistake because I felt like I could perceive it. And even a year and a half later, I still feel like it's lingering there. In the flavor more so than the aroma. The aroma was pretty smelly up front, but the flavor, I feel like I've got this weird minerality to it that I can't account for in any other way.
That kind of leads into a question that Chris Hodge asked about 5 minutes ago. He says, when you say that the yeast seem to need more nutrients for Cysers, what are you looking for? And he said he's had this question a couple times as he's heard you describe while binge listening to previous episodes. That you seem to be at a level of experience where you can tell that your meads need more or less nutrient than what you were planning on giving in the first place. What are your physical indications of this?
Well, I mean, certainly your yeast stress is going to be relatively obvious. You're going to start to smell things that aren't the pleasant aromas of honey that's fermenting down. You know, your fermentation should still have a general sweetness to it as it's proceeding. Once it starts to go beyond that, once you start to get chemical type aromas or minerality, you've got too much of something. CO2 can accumulate to the point where it starts to have, you know, a sensory effect. If you've got too much of it and it's lingering, you can get carbonic acid, so you can get there is an aromatic and a taste component to that. Sulfur, solvents, you know, if you've got a hot fermentation, not only are you going to get ethanol, but you most certainly can get things like acetone, so nail polish remover, paint thinner, some other stuff like that. And this is just, the yeast is just, it's running away at a high metabolism. It's eating everything in sight. It's spitting out whatever byproducts are created from that. And those can just pure ethanol anymore. It's creating other chemicals that are in the alcohol family just because it can. So those things are all, pretty good indicators. I'm pitching a lot of yeast these days. I'm typically pitching 4 to 5 grams a gallon for yeast. The rationale there is that I want to get the fermentation going, and I want to keep it going, and I want it to get done soon. That's not because I'm impatient. Respect the idea that, you can't rush creating a good mead. But the final product that you're looking for isn't just one of the duration of the fermentation. You have time where all of those components need to mellow, and the longer your fermentation is, and therefore the more frequently you may be going in and trying to get samples to measure, the more likely it is that you're going to potentially, introduce contamination. So if you're pitching 4 to 5 grams of yeast, keeping it fed fairly well, most fermentation should be done in a couple weeks or less. So you're limiting that potential contamination time. You're also decreasing the period of time for which you're looking for these sensory cues that something may be wrong with that fermentation. If you're not seeing a fairly consistent pace of the drop in gravity, whether you're measuring that via hydrometer or refractometer, or you're measuring it, by tasting it if you're in there, with a mixing paddle or spoon, mixing it up before you drop nutrients in it. I always pull that paddle up out of the top of the liquid and sprinkle a few drops of it in the palm of my hand and take a taste of it. I'm able to sort of monitor the fermentation pace from that, because 15 years in, I can kind of get a feel for, okay, this is how sweet it tasted yesterday. Okay, it tastes markedly less sweet today. Okay, good. I've made good progress. I don't need to do anything else with it. I'll normally monitor the gravity every few days by measurement during the fermentation rather than every single day. So when you're shortening that period up, if you are not seeing that progress and you've exceeded a couple of weeks for standard, strength mead, something probably is wrong. So that's where keep an eye on how much you fed it. Fermentation is sluggish. It might not be just an issue of nutrition. It could be that your pH is out of whack. Could also be that you may need to actually pitch some additional yeast. If you only pitched a couple of grams per gallon, or a lot of people are still pitching a single pack of yeast for a 5 or 6 gallon batch. That could be a gram or 0.9 grams per gallon of yeast. That's not a lot of yeast. It's going to take a long time for that yeast to really build up a community to rock and roll and do your ferment. And it may take an extended period of time for that ferment. It's probably not desirable. A second or even a third package of yeast will do yourself a service to be able to do that. I'm buying it in 80 gram up to 500 gram packs these days. So if I want 5 grams a gallon of yeast, I'll just go in and measure it out into a container. I'm not pulling open 6 packages or something like that. If you feel like you need to feed it, and it's been several weeks since it started, take a look at the organic nitrogen. Look at Fermento, look at yeast hulls. Don't dose it with Energizer and DAP, and because that stuff it's not going to metabolize all of it, and it's going to stick around. And so use it up front because it works great. But if you've got this long ferment, you think it's stalling or it's going really slowly, be careful about what you add to it, because it'll only eat so much of it, and then the rest of it will stay around.
After 9% ABV, yeast can no longer assimilate DAP at all.
Right.
And incidentally, I'm looking on the Scott's Labs book, and I just looked at the Yan contribution per unit, and Fermento provides 10 milligrams, and DAP provides 50 milligrams of Yan for the same quantity. So DAP is 5 times more potent than Fermento.
Yep.
For Yan per unit.
Yep, and let's remind everyone that sounds like a good thing, and it is. But when? When do you use it? It's a horrible thing to add later in a fermentation, and as Ryan just said, past 9%, the yeast probably won't even touch it, so you're probably not helping them anyway. And now you've got DAP that's dissolved in your mead, and DAP and the amount of it you're using per gallon, per unit of measure, it's actually regulated federally here in the U.S. There's a maximum of how much you can use, because it's, it is, again, not, I guess it's not so much that it's not safe, it's just that there's a tolerance that they don't want, people to go beyond. So that's where having other nutrients on hand. I've mentioned yeast hulls a couple times. That's the dominant ingredient in Fermento, for anybody who doesn't know that. It's predominantly yeast hulls. There are those same things are found in Fermade K. It just happens to be that Fermade K also has, a measure of DAP in it itself. Yeah. So if you're not interested in Fermento or can't get it, but you can get yeast hulls, you have a good source of organic nitrogen that you can use. Just last week, I read an article that indicated that at your 1/3 sugar break addition, using organic nitrogen versus inorganic nitrogen can actually enhance the aromatics in the finished product. It's actually something I'm going to experiment with in a couple of meads I'm going to be making fairly soon, where my 4th edition, I'm going to strip out my superfood, which is my Fermade K equivalent, and use just yeast hulls or Fermento, depending on whether I have one or the other around, and just see whether it's noticeable. Because if it's noticeable, boy, I'm sure going to change, because aromas and more of them, if they're pleasant, is always welcome.
I can.
Go ahead, Ryan. Sorry.
I'm sorry. No,
that's Manny.
It's Manny. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I can tell you that Fermento was so much better than Fermade K. The first time I used it, that I just posted it on the chat there, that I never went back to K after using O. It was just so much cleaner and fruitier and nicer. Everything was much better.
Yeah, it's really funny.
Manny, I started using. Go ahead, Vicky.
I was just gonna say that for many years I used yeast hulls. Period, because that was what was available. There wasn't any Fermade K or Fermento, and and then everybody was like, "Oh, Fermade K," so I started using that. And all along, I had it right in the first place.
Well, I don't.
Personally, I started using I started using Ferment O as soon as I heard about it, and almost right away, I was using a little bit of K on my